karena masih dalam masa pandemi, kita selenggarakan secara virtual. Hari ini, selama 2 hari ini, kita akan mengambil tema tentang Good Regulatory Practices. Minggu lalu kita sudah bicara bagaimana Good Standardization Practices dilaksanakan, dan hari ini kita mencoba untuk menyambungkan dengan regulatory. Nah, dalam kehidupan bernegara sebenarnya inilah yang apa yang harus kita jalankan, Bapak Ibu. Izin sekedar memperkenalkan, saya sharing PowerPoint ya Bapak Ibu. Baik, ini sekedar untuk opening mengingatkan. Jadi kita mempunyai kegiatan ARISE+ yang dilaksanakan dengan EU dari 2019 sampai dengan 2023. Ini ada 4 priority area. Priority area 1 itu tentang Trade and Investment Policy. Priority area 2 itu Trade Facilitation. Priority 3 itu Export Quality Infrastructure, di mana membicarakan tentang standar, conformity assessment, metrologi, dan market surveillance, di mana ini koordinatornya adalah Ditstanlitu, Direktorat Standarisasi dan Penilaian Mutu Kementerian Perdagangan, dengan mengikutkan Kementerian Perindustrian, KKP, Badan POM, dan BSN. Priority keempat itu adalah IPR, focusing on geographical indicator, jadi membicarakan tentang HG, terutama kepada IG, indikasi geografis. Kita sudah menyelenggarakan workshop mulai dari tadi disebutkan 2019 Bapak Ibu, 2 kali workshop di Bogor. Ini masih dalam kondisi kita bisa bertatap muka tentang standar dan dalam kerangka kebijakan publik dan regulasi, tanggal 16-17 Oktober dan 23-24 Oktober. Kemudian 2020 karena sudah masuk pandemi, kita laksanakan 1 offline, 2 virtual. Pertama tentang workshop standarisasi dan regulasi yang ada di EU, ini tanggal 16 dan 23 Januari. Kemudian workshop virtual review, workshop virtual tentang review prosedur pengembangan standar, ini 10 Desember. Kemudian tanggal 17 Desember kita mengadakan workshop tentang GRP dan Regulatory Impact Assessment. Kemudian 2021 itu kita menyelenggarakan workshop virtual untuk sektor pangan, dilaksanakan tanggal 16, 28, dan 23 November. 2022 ini kita minggu lalu sudah menyelenggarakan tentang Good Standardisation Practices 15-16 Februari, dan hari ini dan esok hari Bapak Ibu kita akan menyelenggarakan tentang Good Regulatory Practices. Ini kita tahu bahwa kenapa latar belakang ini dilakukan tadi sudah dalam kerangka ARISE+. Ini perdagangan antar negara menjadi semakin terbuka Bapak Ibu. Masing-masing negara cenderung menandatangani perjanjian untuk satu kawasan, untuk berusaha membuat dalam tanda kutip benteng oleh masing-masing kawasan Bapak Ibu. Kemudian hambatan tarif ini sesuai dengan data yang ada di WTO itu semakin tidak populer. Kemudian technical barrier on trade atau lebih dikenal dengan TBT menjadi alternatif yang bisa diterima di internasional. Nah, ini kecenderungan Bapak Ibu sebelum tahun 1994 perdagangan antara satu negara ke negara lain itu biasanya kita bicara tentang bagaimana kondisi produk, kemudian teknikalnya dalam artian spesifikasi teknisnya, kemudian bicara tarif, subsidi, dan kuota. Antar satu negara dengan negara lain, pembatasan-pembatasan itu coba diatasi dengan itu. Kemudian sesudah implementasi Uruguay Round ini atau putaran Uruguay, ini satu negara ke negara lain mulai berkurang Bapak Ibu, kuota dan subsidi ini mulai hampir ditinggalkan. Kemudian yang menjadi semakin banyak itu adalah technical barrier Bapak Ibu. Nah, inilah yang kemudian bagaimana kita bicarakan bagaimana hal ini harus diantisipasi. Dalam forum atau GATT-WTO ini, jadi mulai dari General Agreement on Tariff itu beralih kepada World Trade Organization. Ini ada beberapa yang harus kita ketahui bersama Bapak Ibu. Kalau GATT itu biasanya bentuknya ad hoc dan provisional ya. Kemudian GATT ini merupakan kontrak antar parti Bapak Ibu, dalam hal ini negara bentuknya. Kemudian di dalam GATT ini masih membolehkan aturan-aturan domestik untuk bagaimana kita kemudian mengatasi beberapa hal yang terjadi di dalam agreement itu. Nah, di dalam WTO ini sendiri sudah berubah Bapak Ibu, bentuk dari agreement-nya adalah permanen, kemudian yang masuk ke WTO itu kita sebut juga sebagai member, kemudian ada beberapa yang mengikat di dalam perjanjian ini, sebagai member dari WTO. Nah, secara garis besar ini WTO lebih powerful daripada GATT, di mana ini nanti kemudian adanya dispute di antara satu negara ini mekanismenya menjadi lebih cepat ditertangani, kemudian lebih efisien, sehingga akan sangat sulit untuk membuat suatu blocking antara satu aturan dengan aturan yang lainnya. Nah, sebenarnya GATT itu sendiri, General Agreement on Trade and Tariff, ini terdiri dari 12 agreement Bapak Ibu. Ada agriculture, SPS, sanitary and phytosanitary measures, kemudian TPT, technical barrier to trade, textile and clothing, trade, related investment measure, anti-dumping, custom valuation methods, pre-shipment inspection, rule of origin, import licensing procedure, subsidi and countervailing, dan safeguard. Ini beberapa negara masih menggunakan beberapa waktu lalu produk-produk kita kena dalam tanda kutip semacam safeguard yang dilakukan oleh China. Kemudian kita juga mulai dalam tanda kutip mengantisipasi rules of origin. Ini Bapak Ibu yang harus kita perhatikan. Selain fokus utama kita bagaimana Tbt itu kita coba atasi. Nah, hari ini kita akan membicarakan, hari ini dan esok hari, kita akan membicarakan tentang Good Regulatory Practices. Kita tahu bahwa suatu undang-undang, suatu regulasi yang bentuknya hukum positif itu semua tercantum dalam undang-undang. Tapi ada beberapa yang tidak tercantum, ini yang berlaku di masyarakat, itu juga kita harus waspadai Bapak Ibu. Kemudian, di luar itu Bapak Ibu, partisipasi masyarakat, partisipasi stakeholder, terutama dalam satu negara, ini harus kita perhatikan Bapak Ibu. Nah, hari ini bagaimana kalau dalam satu undang-undang tentunya kita tidak bisa menyampaikan secara detail teknis, kemudian undang-undang itu kita turunkan dalam peraturan di bawahnya, permen atau semacamnya Bapak Ibu, maka itu yang biasa kita sebut dengan technical regulation. Nah, technical regulation ini karena menyangkut hal-hal teknis, misalnya ukuran, bentuk, dalam tanda kutip beberapa dimensi atau beberapa persyaratan teknis ini, sering kita lupa nanti implementasinya. Apalagi di Indonesia kita bicara adanya otonomi daerah yang barangkali dalam pelaksanaan ini menimbulkan salah satu bentuk konsekuensi yang harus dilaksanakan oleh daerah, dan hal tersebut menjadi agak sulit bagi suatu daerah untuk melaksanakan karena terjadinya beberapa perbedaan, baik itu gap secara kompetensi maupun infrastruktur mutu yang ada. Nah, dikaitkan dengan minggu lalu kita bicara Good Standardisation Practices, posisi dari standar ini kita akan bisa masuk ke situ. Nah, hari ini kita akan membicarakan tentang Good Regulatory Practices, bagaimana suatu regulator itu dibentuk, seharusnya dibentuk, hubungan antara GRP dengan Tbt WTO Tbt Agreement, kemudian nanti apa yang sudah selama ini kita lakukan, public consultation ini bagaimana dijalankan dengan baik supaya nanti waktu implementasi suatu peraturan itu tidak terjadi permasalahan di belakang hari. Nah, termasuk ini yang mungkin kita harus pelajari lebih mendalam, terutama tentang regulatory impact assessment. Bagaimana sebenarnya suatu kebijakan itu kemudian diwujudkan dalam peraturan. Peraturan ini sebelum kita melakukan atau mengambil, menuangkan dalam bentuk peraturan yang hitam di atas putih, harus kita kaji bagaimana impact-nya kalau suatu peraturan itu akan dilakukan. Nah, kemampuan kita untuk menganalisis, mengasesmen peraturan tersebut, baik itu sebelum dilakukan maupun sesudah, supaya nanti kita evaluasi untuk perbaikan, ini akan menjadi pilar yang penting dalam pembuatan regulatory. Demikian sebagai pengantar, saya berharap Bapak Ibu bisa memetik hikmah daripada apa yang akan diselenggarakan dalam 2 hari ini. Terima kasih, saya kembalikan kepada Mita.
Baik Pak Wahyu, terima kasih untuk openingnya. Selanjutnya sesuai informasi di chat, maka akan dilakukan sesi foto bersama. Bapak Ibu silakan untuk on kamera, akan dipandu oleh Sekretariat ARISE+, silakan.
Terima kasih Mbak Mita. Untuk Bapak Ibu mohon untuk diaktifkan video karena kami terdapat 5 slide, jadi harap bersabar Bapak Ibu. Oke, baik Bapak Ibu, saya akan mulai dalam hitungan ketiga. Mohon standby ya Bapak Ibu. 1, 2, 3 untuk slide pertama, smile. Selanjutnya untuk slide kedua, 1, 2, 3. Terima kasih Bapak Ibu. Selanjutnya untuk slide ketiga, 1, 2, 3. Terima kasih Bapak Ibu. Untuk slide keempat, terima kasih Bapak Ibu. Slide yang terakhir. Oke, baik. Terima kasih Bapak Ibu. Kembali ke Mbak Mita.
Terima kasih Mbak Siti. Selanjutnya adalah sesi workshop yang akan dibawakan oleh Mr. Karsten Gudal. Apabila selama workshop ada pertanyaan dari Bapak dan Ibu, nanti bisa disampaikan di chat room dengan format yang nanti akan diinformasikan lebih lanjut. Baik, dipersilakan kepada Mr. Karsten. Time is yours.
Thank you very much, Mita. Thank you very much, Pavihu, for this introduction. It saves me a bit of time about the presentation of the program. But firstly, I would like to say welcome to all the participants today. And then I will share, as usual, my slides, which are here. I guess you can see them, right? Yeah.
Yes.
Good. Okay. Yeah, first of all, welcome to all the participants. I recognize some of the names from last week. Perhaps it's more or less the same audience we have this time. It's nice for me because then I can also make some references to standardization, a good standardization practice without leaving somebody out of this. Perhaps some of you are wondering, how can he train 1 week in good standardization practice? He's a standardization expert, and the next week in good regulatory practice. But I would like to introduce myself a bit, my background, since I feel that I'm capable of this. Firstly, I'm a lawyer. They also use lawyers in the standardization world from time to time. And before I started working at Danish Standards many years ago, I was working in the Ministry of Commerce in Denmark. I was also drafting laws. I was also involved in the whole process of receiving comments to draft laws and draft regulations. So I know the system, how it works from inside, you can say. After that, when I left standardization, I became a freelance consultant. I have been involved in many different projects, and in some of them, good regulatory practice and development of regulatory impact assessments have been a part of the projects. So therefore, over the years, I have developed some experience both from practice, but also from theory about how it works in practice, you can say. Good regulatory practice is not exactly the same as when it comes to rules and so on as it is with good standardization practice. Good standardization practice was very much based on rules. We have rules for everything. We have rules for what we can expect from a secretariat, what we can expect from a chairman, and so on and so on. This is not the case with good regulatory practice. It's more based on some principles and some recommendations. So therefore, it's not kind of a recipe on how to do things, but it is a presentation today and tomorrow on how things could be done to comply with the good regulatory practice. Good regulatory practice is in general given a lot of attention these years because, as Pavihu emphasized in his introduction, GRP is closely related to trade. Some of you may know the rules about notification of new technical regulations in the WTO system to ensure that there is some kind of transparency about new technical regulations, which may have some kind of create some kind of technical barriers to trade, and therefore there is a need for transparency. This is you can say the trade-related or the trade legislation or the trade area implementing good regulatory practice worldwide. It serves many different purposes, both domestically and internationally. Domestically, you will see in many countries, I've also seen it in Indonesia, I must admit, that ministries are very big. And when they have some kind of problem, then the solution is quite often to issue new technical regulation. It's a kind of a quick fix, a way to solve problems. It's not only Indonesia, you will see it in many countries. What is sometimes forgotten is to ensure that this quick fix, that this regulation is aligned or coordinated with regulation which is close to this regulation, but is managed or issued by other ministries. So therefore, there is a huge need for coordination between ministries. I'll give you some examples later on, also from Indonesia, on how things can go wrong if you don't respect the principles of good regulatory practice. On international level, it's very much about ensuring transparency, knowing what is going on in other countries. Today, international trade is so big that you can't just ignore what is going on the other side of the border. Companies in Denmark, for example, where I live, they have most of their trade in the neighboring countries like Germany, like Sweden, like Norway, like UK. And you have to know what is going on there. If they change legislation and so on, there is a need for transparency and sometimes also to deliver, submit comments to legislation issued in other countries. It is possible under the WTO system to do so if some kind of legislation has a negative impact on the free trade. So there's a lot of good reasons why we look at good regulatory practice today. It is another thing than good standardization practice, and I know that there are people from the standardization world here, but I think it's still very relevant, and it's for sure very relevant for all people who are working in ministries or legislatory agencies issuing legislation and so on. I have merged some of the items on the agenda so that this agenda looks a bit more simple than the one you saw just a few minutes ago presented by Pavihu, but all the topics or the items on the other agenda, they are still here. I have just given myself a bit more flexibility with regard to presenting the different items in the agenda. But today we'll start with what is good regulatory practice and why is it so important. OECD, which is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, they have given advice on or made recommendations about good regulatory practice along many years. And back in 2012, they made 12 recommendations, which are still valid. And I will try to go through these recommendations and also try to put a few more words on them than just reading them. After that, we will look at the international aspect of GRP, how it plays together with the WTO Tbt Agreement. When you talk about Tbt, then you also automatically think of, at least when you have my background, you think about standardization. It's all interconnected. And then we go to the three core elements in good regulatory practice, namely the internal coordination and of rulemaking activities, which is directly related to what you just said, that sometimes ministries do not ensure that new legislation is aligned with legislation from other ministries, for example. The public consultation mechanisms to improve transparency, how it works, and what is seen in other countries. And then finally, a short introduction to regulatory impact assessment, which is the area I will dive into more deeply tomorrow. Regulatory impact assessment is more a kind of a technique. It's not only recommendations, it's more a technique how to do things. And it's also a technique which is good to have as a civil servant so that you know what to think of when new technical regulation is considered or about to be issued. Good regulatory practice refers to internationally recognized processes and procedures, how things are processed through from you start from a policy until you have a technical regulation, and the procedures in all these steps that can be used to improve quality and cost effectiveness of domestic regulations. It's important when you issue new technical regulation that you consider what are the consequences. Could this be done in another way? Could it be done more simple? Could it be done so that it has less costs for the small and medium-sized enterprises, for example? or it's not so big a burden to administrate for the public authorities. So what it is not, it's not about how to write a legal text. It's funny that I have this more or less on the first slide, because when I come to one of the very last slides, there is a checklist. And this checklist actually also includes that, that legislation shall be written in plain words. Good legislation is legislation which can be read and understood by everyone. Good legislation is not something where you from the first minute need a lawyer who can interpret what is written here. So, but this is not what we are going to focus on when we talk good regulatory practice. It's not about writing. It's not either a template for legal drafting. Here you see a difference from the good standardization practice, where we have a template for standards. No matter how the standards, what they shall cover, tests, it may be product requirements, it may be systems, they always use the same template. This is not the case when it comes to technical regulation, and therefore it's also not the case when it comes to good regulatory practice. And it's not about giving the drafters of new technical regulation some kind of exam. They shall live up to certain requirements or things like that. I think the best teams I have worked in when we have drafted new legislation, and it was perhaps a more commerce related, not so technical, but the best teams is when you have some practitioners, perhaps with a background from the private sector, together with lawyers. Then you can, in a way, develop something which is applicable out in the real world. So, but this is not what this is about. This is it's not an exam. It's not about specific requirements to the drafters. Why is good regulatory practice so important? What indicates that? If you ask yourself what indicates that improvement of legislative procedures are needed, it is, for example, when you have overlaps, when you see, as I have experienced myself, that suddenly the food safety authorities, they have one piece of legislation, and where I worked, the authorities responsible for construction products, they have another piece of legislation, but certainly the legislation from these two authorities were overlapping each other. This is not good coordination. This is something which should be addressed at an early stage so that you don't confuse the users of the legislation. I realized it when I worked in construction area in a ministry. I was responsible for the market surveillance team, and we should control products in the building sector. It means also, for example, the piping for water. But as long as the water is in the pipe, then the piping system is considered to be a construction product. But when it came out the water, then it was suddenly a food product. And because then you actually can drink it, and then therefore it's per definition a food product. And we had some legislation which was about migration from the piping system into the water, and while they had another kind of test for the cleanness of the water in the food safety authorities. It required a lot of coordination to find out how these two pieces of legislation could play together. It's just an example of how easily you can end up in a situation where legislation is overlapping. Different kind of sanctions. Market surveillance, as I just mentioned, is something which is used for products placed on the market. In Europe, we have market surveillance for a lot of different kind of products: machinery products, pressure equipment. We have it for electrical equipment. We have it for toys. If products are non-compliant, if they simply dangerous and they are found by market surveillance officers or inspectors, then sometimes there is a sanction. But these sanctions, they should be proportionate. They should not, for one kind of product, it cannot be a huge fine, and for another kind of product, it can be a lifted, a finger where they take care of this. And so there should be some kind of coordination, some kind of leveling of the sanctions, so that the different areas are sanctioned in the same fair way. So different sanctions, if it's not in the same level, then or aligned, then you have in a way bad legislation. Lack of coordination between legislative bodies or ministries. My example from the food safety and construction product area is a good example. Users are unprepared. Sometimes you see a problem somewhere and the politicians, they react very quickly and say, we shall do something here. And the civil servants say, let's make a law, let's make a decree. And then they issue it quick. And sometimes you have a situation where the users, the people who are impacted by this piece of legislation, are actually not prepared at all for this legislation. And therefore they can come from a situation where they had products on the shelves which were totally legal one day, and shortly after it's not allowed to sell it. This kind of unpreparedness is something you see if people have not been, or users have not been informed in due time. So this is examples on how, when you have legislation which legislative procedures which are not sufficient. GRP also address exactly these shortcomings, and GRP address exactly these shortcomings in the legislative process. It ensures that there is no overlap. It ensures that people are informed in due time. It ensures that there is openness about what is going on. The OECD, they made a recommendation back in 2012. It was still in the middle of the financial crisis, but they said that the financial crisis and the pace of social change and environmental challenges highlight the importance of sound regulatory frameworks as a basic condition for well-functioning markets and societies, protecting the environment and the promotion of economic growth. This was the kind of the preamble to the 12 recommendations I will present to you a bit later. GRP, and we'll come back to this, GRP covers different areas. Some of these areas are systems which are established at an early stage, and then they just work. I will come back to this, but for example, there is a need for some kind of coordinating unit which evaluate how the GRP procedures are implemented and so on. This is a one-time thing you should do when you establish or implement good regulatory practice. But there are others which is ongoing, and three of the core elements, in my opinion at least, I think in most people's opinion, of GRP is that the administrative procedures that govern intergovernmental coordination of rule activity is an important part of GRP. Usually, this is when we come to all this coordination between the ministries. Then you have the impact assessment, or the regulatory impact assessment we are going to talk about tomorrow. It's about knowing what are actually the consequences when you implement new legislation. We will go much deeper into this, but just to give you a little teaser about what it is. When you implement new technical regulation, it always has some kind of impact. I have worked in Eastern European countries which should adopt all the European legislation because they were about to become members of the EU. It means that they should implement systems, legislative systems, which were totally different from what they had earlier. There was a long tradition in these Eastern European countries like Czech Republic, the Baltic countries, Poland, and so on, that before you could place a product on the market, then you had to have an approval of the product. You went to the relevant ministry or agency, and they checked the product and said, yes, you can place it, it's safe, you can place it on the market. In Europe, we have another approach where we say it's the manufacturer who is responsible for the market for the product he places on the market. It means that he shall carry out all the tests. He shall make a technical file where he describes how he complies with the standards, if there are standards for the product, or how he just ensure that the product is safe. So therefore, when they implemented in these Eastern European countries the new legislation from Europe, they had to turn around their system from one day to another, or it was over a period, but it was still a revolution in how to look at products placed on the market. Suddenly, they also had market surveillance authorities which should check the products when they were placed on the market. So the bottom line was that the quick fix was just to implement, to write the legislation. It was quite easy. You had the legislation from Europe. It should be implemented as it was written. But the consequences when it came to establishment of market surveillance authorities was, for example, huge. They were used to have some inspectors checking products in the market, but it was typically old people from military or from police, and they were very harsh when it came to non-compliant products. The philosophy in Europe was that you should go into a dialogue with the traders or the manufacturers and find a solution instead of just giving a fine immediately. So there was a cultural change which made it very difficult to implement these new rules. So at the same time, new kind of documentation should be made for each product. The so-called technical files, which will follow all CE-marked products, was a new thing, and all the manufacturers had to learn this. So what they didn't do in many of these countries was to carry out an impact assessment, say, what are the consequences for the public authorities? Do they have the market surveillance organizations in place? Do they have all the standards which were needed to support the implementation of the new legislation? Did they have these standards adopted as national standards? Were the small and medium-sized enterprises ready to affix CE-marked marks on their products if they were covered by one of these pieces of legislation? It was a huge revolution for their systems, and an impact assessment had shown it, but they didn't make it in many of these countries, and therefore the consequences were quite severe because it was from one word to another in a very short period. And then we talk about regulatory transparency on the GRP. We know from standardization that when you have a draft standard, then it should go out to public inquiry. It's exactly the same you have in GRP. And I think that standardization was first with this tool. But you simply share to the public what you intend to implement of new legislation, as you do in the standardization world, where you say, this is what we intend to adopt as an international standard. Please provide your comments if you have any. And this is also what is required in good regulatory practice. So these are the three core elements in GRP: coordination, impact assessment, so you know the consequences, and transparency. As I said, the OECD, they have 12 recommendations to how to implement good regulatory practice. The first one is to commit at the highest level to an explicit whole of government policy of regulatory quality. Successful implementation of GRP requires commitments from the highest level, especially when you think about the coordination part. How can you coordinate only in one ministry? You can coordinate in between the agencies if you have some agencies under the ministry or different units or divisions, but if you don't coordinate with the other ministries which are somehow involved or have an interest in the specific field, then you have a problem. So therefore, when it comes to implementation of GRP, then you shall commit yourself from the highest level. This can be done by, for example, a presidential decree where they declare that now systems shall be established to live up to the GRP principles. You can say in short that the implementation of GRP shall be decided on the highest level, and the consequences shall be clear, and the benefits shall exceed the costs. It's sometimes, and we will come back to this also a bit later, when you decide, for example, for what shall you prepare a regulatory impact assessment, which is a document which requires some resources to develop and so on. Then you shall also know that the time you invest in developing such a regulatory impact assessment somehow provide or give as a result some useful information. The explanation I got when I worked in Eastern Europe that we don't want regulatory impact assessment on this was that we cannot change anything anyway. We shall take it as it is. It could still have given them a lot to carry out the work with an RIA for some of the legislation, simply just to mitigate the consequences for the users of the legislation. But they just found in many cases that it was unnecessary because it was given how it should look like, the legislation, because it should be identical with the European legislation. You shall already, when you write, commit yourself on the highest level to GRP, you shall have this focus on distributional effects. Distributional effects is how, basically, who are the winners and who are the losers. When you implement new technical regulation, for example, which requires more testing, which requires systems like management systems in the production, then it can be difficult to implement as a small or medium-sized enterprise, while the bigger companies, they may have it already. So therefore, when you implement new legislation, it's important to think about what will be the consequences, who will be the winners, maybe the big companies, while the smaller ones, they will be the losers. So distributional effects is an important part which shall be addressed already on the highest level when you decide to commit yourself to GRP. Then you shall adhere to principles of open government, including transparency and participation in the regulatory process, to ensure that regulation serves the public interest and is informed by legitimate needs of those interested in the affected by the regulation. This includes providing meaningful opportunities, online also, for the public to contribute. This is the direct recommendation about carrying out some kind of consultation, a public inquiry when you issue new technical regulation. It's one of the recommendations and one of the cornerstones in the GRP system. It is the transparency part. When I worked a couple of years, many years ago now, in Sarajevo in Bosnia, they implemented good regulatory practice, also implemented development of regulatory impact assessments. And at that time, it was really crucial that this transparency part worked, because they were in a period where it was more or less all the technical regulations should be changed from the former Yugoslavian time to a more EU-aligned legislation. And therefore, it had some consequences for the users, and they should be given a chance to look into the legislation at an early stage, and also to read the regulatory impact assessment and see, perhaps also read whether they were among the winners or the losers when this new legislation was introduced. So the transparency part in Bosnia, where I worked, was something really crucial when the good regulatory practice principles were implemented. Governments should also, it says, ensure that regulations are comprehensively and clear, and that parties can easily understand their rights and obligations. Here we are back to what we talked about in the very beginning, that legal text shall be readable also for normal people, not only for lawyers. So this is one of the things which actually is included as a part of the transparency requirements. In short, there should be more involvement of stakeholders. Stakeholders are not only the public servants and the politicians, it's all the users. There should be a consultation. The consultation can have many forms. It can be an online platform where you can go in and follow. Perhaps you get notifications about new legislation of your interest. Let's say I'm interested in food regulation, and therefore every time there is some new in the food area, I get a notification that now new legislation is on its way. You can have hearings or focus group discussions. I have participated in some focus group discussions, for example, for when they should implement in Bosnia legislation about cement. And you had producers, big producers of cement, and small producers, which were more like trading cement imported to Bosnia. And it was interesting to listen to these discussions. And it also resulted in some changes of the legislation, because the big and dominant companies, they could easily have squeezed out the small importers of cement if we had kept the legislation as it was suggested from the beginning. So hearings and discussions directly are of huge value when you implement new technical regulation. So therefore you also have this, you can say, a dialogue with the users. Then you should establish a mechanism and institutions to actually provide oversight of regulatory policy procedures and goals. Since GRP is something which is implemented horizontally, not only in one ministry, you can prepare yourself in a ministry, but the whole idea is that it is on governmental level, or on the whole state administration, and also the provincial administration, which shall actually implement GRP. You can't do it isolated in one ministry if it shall work effectively. Of course, you will have some benefits if you, for example, have more transparency in one ministry when you issue new technical regulation, but the full effect or all the benefits are only gained in case you implement it horizontally. So therefore you need a body, a unit with the right competences and expertise, which can ensure that there is an oversight of regulatory policy procedures, that it is done in the same way in the different ministries. So they can have a role as coordinators, as trainers. An important part of implementing, for example, regulatory impact assessment is that the civil servants are trained in how to develop RIAs, as they called, regulatory impact assessments themselves, because sometimes you have to hire experts, but it can be very costly if you have to go to consultancies every time you need a new regulatory impact assessment. So therefore, and we'll come back to this later as well, therefore there are ways of preparing so-called initial regulatory impact assessments, which are more simple and can be prepared by civil servants, and which give a brilliant overview of what you should pay attention to in the further development of the technical regulation. So there are a lot of different tasks which can be given to such an institution, but training and sharing information, writing guides and so on is for sure part of it. So their role, or its role, will be to strengthen the capacity and to coordinate and ensure coherency, ensure that things are done the same way. And then capacity building, quality assurance. It's quite obvious when you have worked like me in many different ministries in Indonesia also, the focus is different from ministry to ministry. The culture is different from ministry to ministry. And therefore, you cannot expect that everything is aligned, that you do things exactly the same way, because you have different ways of thinking, different priorities also. And but when it comes to DRP, where you need to have some kind of alignment, some kind of harmonization, then such a unit, they can ensure that the quality of, for example, the regulatory impact assessments is the same in the different ministries. You should integrate RIA, regulatory impact assessment, into the early stages of the policy process. It's easier to make RIA when you have a final version of the technical regulation. Then you know exactly what is required with regard to conformity assessment procedures, what kind of tests shall be carried out. You can put figures on everything. You know exactly that this test will cost so much, which is a new test and will be a new cost for the manufacturers. And in that way, you can be very precise. But this is not the way regulatory impact assessments shall be used. They should be used when you have a policy on something and you want to develop some legislation in this field. Then you shall try to develop this regulatory impact assessment as early as possible, so that it can follow the technical regulation when you have a public inquiry or a consultation with the users. So RIA shall be presented as early as possible. When a piece of legislation is going into the political system, it's really difficult to pull it back and say, by the way, we have found out that it has some severe consequences for this group. It's much better to make these corrections at an early stage. If you find out that suddenly, if you keep a technical regulation as it is, that it will have some consequences for specific kind of companies, for specific kind of people, then it's important that you identify these things at an early stage and find out, is the benefits we get by implementing this legislation bigger than the costs for these groups of people who may need some kind of help afterwards, simply because we give them a hard time by implementing this legislation. So the use of regulatory impact assessment shall happen as early as possible in the legislatory process. And at this time, when you do it, then you shall identify consequences of the new legislation. Consequences are both when it comes to access to market, but it's also about simply what are the new costs. I mean, when we implemented European legislation in Eastern Europe, and they suddenly should produce technical files with test reports, and it cost money, and it has to be calculated how much money does it actually cost for all these companies to produce these new kind of documentation for their products. You can also, in some cases, this was not the case in Eastern Europe, but identify alternative means, another way to achieve the same political or policy goals or policy objectives, but just with another mean. We had in Denmark places to scrap cars, old cars which could not be used anymore. They could be put in a place, we call it a cemetery for a car, and then they were dismantled, and some of the parts were reused as kind of spare parts for other people with old cars. It has been like this for many, many years. But when we started to be more environmentally aware, then we found out that a lot of the oil from and other kind of fluids from these cars, it ended up on the soil, on the ground, and it was going down and actually impacted the water in the ground. So therefore, a piece of legislation was developed where there were all kind of detailed requirements to these owners of these car cemeteries. But we found out that it would administratively be a huge burden for the public authorities, and therefore they found out that instead of making really detailed requirements to these small businesses, they decided that they should have an environmental management system. An environmental management system, you cannot have such a system without ensuring that you don't drip with oil directly on the soil, on the ground. It has to be controlled somehow. The cars had to be dry before they ended up outside. So therefore, there should be procedures how to empty for oil, for these fluids you use for your brakes, for your clutch, for your whatever. So all these things were part of a management system. And this was a way, and then you actually handed it over to the certification bodies, which were checking these the compliance with the management system. They handed over the responsibility to ensure that the requirements were met, but not by having a legislation, but having this this management system. So there are different ways of achieving the same goal, but it's not always the technical or the technical regulation with a lot of detailed requirements which shall be followed up by authorities, which is the best one. There are alternatives where you have also self-regulation or simply just training, where you can achieve the same. You shall also develop scenarios. We'll come back to this, but this is a basic thing. When you develop regulatory impact assessments, you shall not only think about one way. You can also say, what if we don't do anything? This is the first scenario. If we don't regulate here, what will happen? How bad is it? Is it really necessary to develop new technical regulation in this field to regulate it? So a baseline scenario is to say, we don't do anything, we just let it be. And then you can say, we can also go this way with a technical regulation, or we can try with self-regulation, or we can try with a mandatory certification carried out by certification bodies. There are many different ways of regulating markets, and these scenarios shows how the different tools impacts the users and the environment or whatever it may be when you implement. Then you should have systematic reviews. One of these things you establish one time, systematic reviews of the stock of significant regulation. We have primary legislation, secondary, and it depends on which country you're working in, but there are different ways of doing things. You have presidential decrees, ministerial decrees. We don't have that so much where I come from. But there are different ways of regulating. And when you have good regulatory practice, then you shall have systematic reviews of the significant regulation, typically primary and perhaps secondary, against clearly defined policy goals, including consideration of cost and benefits to ensure that regulations remain up to date and cost justified. Sometimes some regulation is getting obsolete. You have to say it's not relevant any longer. We can repeal it. We had in Denmark back in time problems with wood stoves. Wood stoves to warm up, especially summer houses or cottages where people were living in the summertime and sometimes also a bit in the wintertime. These wood stoves were back in time quite old ones, and they became an environmental problem because there were a lot of particles coming up from the chimneys, and it was smelling, and it was they were actually not using or utilizing the wood very well. So therefore we implemented some legislation which should regulate this, should ensure that new wood stoves installed, that they were living up to some requirements. And then there was, we have an inspection scheme for chimneys, and these people who inspected the chimneys, they should certainly also inspect these wood stoves. It was of course costly, and but these inspectors earned some extra money. It was private businesses, but it was costly, and over time they didn't find much because these wood stoves, the old ones, they were so inefficient that most people, they just replaced them with modern ones. So this mandatory certification or inspection we had established was not really needed any longer. So therefore the legislation was repealed, because it was now people were more focusing on having more efficient wood stoves which utilized the wood as good as possible, and at the same time perhaps also got a better relationship to the neighbors because it was not smelling so much any longer. So this is what you see sometimes, and this requires that you look at your old legislation and say, is it really necessary any longer? Do we have this problem any longer? So a systematic program review of significant legislation or regulation against clear defined policy goals is needed. And this is what you can call an ex post review of regulation. Ex post is mean after it has been issued. Then you take a look at it again, perhaps after 3, 4, 5, or 10 years, and say, is it really something we need? And then you can review the cost and benefits and so on, and decide whether it shall stay as it is, it should be changed, or it shall be repealed. In that way, you have kind of a quality assurance of existing legislation, so that you don't have a lot of legislation which is unnecessary or basically just a burden both for the users but also for the authorities. You should publish reports about the performance of regulatory policy and reform programs. Such reports should also include information on how regulatory tools such as regulatory impact assessments, public consultations, and so on, how they are working in practice. This is a task which is typically will be given to this new coordination unit, which also carry out training and coordination and so on. They should also publish reports to carry out some kind of independent review of the system. So it is a review of the performance and also a check whether the different ministries actually follow what has been agreed in the very beginning, when the presidential decree or whatever it is, when it is decided that good regulatory practice shall be implemented. There should be developed consistent policy covering the role and functions of regulatory agencies in order to provide greater confidence that regulatory decisions are made on an objective, impartial, and consistent basis. I have worked in many different countries, and in one of them I visited was the Philippines once, and I realized when I met different authorities that, for example, the agency responsible for giving frequencies on the telecommunication areas, that when I talked to all the other agencies and they talked about this agency, they said they are in the hands of the big telecommunication companies. It's not, they are not doing things impartially any longer. And when I actually met them, because I had a meeting with this agency, then I could see that the cops, they were from the one big, from one of the big telecommunication companies. And it was just very clear that this impartiality, which is a requirement for all agencies and ministries, it did not exist there any longer. They were simply just too influenced by a specific interest. So this is something which is also should be taken into consideration when you talk about good regulatory practice. So there should be some kind of policy. Policy is something which is not necessarily with sanctions, but it's a more kind of a principle for politicians that we shall ensure that ministries and agencies carry out their mandates on an objective, impartial, and consistent basis. Then we shall ensure, or it shall be ensured, that effectiveness of systems for the review of the legality and procedural fairness of regulations and of decisions made by bodies empowered to issue regulatory sanctions. There should be a system for the review of the fairness of regulation. Many stakeholders may be affected by new legislation, and therefore it is important to have access to information, for example, about what will be the sanctions for non-compliance. So this is a part of GRP as well, to ensure that citizens and businesses have access to systems and review at a reasonable cost, so that they are informed in a timely manner. So it's very much, the idea is very much to ensure that regulations are imposed correctly with regard to administration, sanctions, etc. One of the more fluffy recommendations of the OECD. As appropriate, apply risk assessment, risk management, and risk communication strategies to the design and implementation of regulations to ensure that regulation is targeted and effective. Regulators should assess how regulations will be given effect, effect and should design responsive implementation and enforcement strategies. Risk management is used in many contexts, and when it is mentioned here, then it's to ensure that the measures are taken to avoid inappropriate consequences of new legislation. When we look at regulatory impact assessments later on, then it's actually a part of developing a regulatory impact assessment that when you have identified some consequences, inappropriate consequences of new legislation, then you can take some measures to mitigate these consequences. We have some of the legislation in Europe when it was implemented in these Eastern European countries, then you could actually decide only to implement it for some product areas, so that not all product areas were covered by new legislation immediately. This was a way to give some kind of transition period for the businesses to adapt their systems and their products to the new legislation. This is a way to take measures to ensure that that people are not affected negatively or too much negatively by new technical regulation. So this application of risk management and risk assessment and risk communication means that outputs, for example, from the RIA is used as a plan B is ready. I mean, when you implement new legislation, you cannot avoid that it has some consequences, but you can at least do something to make it easier to the users of the companies or whatever it may be, private persons who are affected by this new legislation. Where appropriate, promote regulatory coherence through coordination mechanisms. It's almost always appropriate to ensure coherence and coordination. I had earlier, 2019, I had meetings with different business associations during the so-called inception phase of our project. One of the agents or the business associations I met was, I think it was called GAP MMI or something like that, for food and beverages. And they gave me an example of lack of coordination. There was a representative of a company producing biscuits. And when you produce biscuits, then there is a control of the raw materials for the biscuits, flour, for example. It's done by the Ministry of Agriculture because they are, or the wheat or whatever it's used, it's done by the Ministry of Agriculture. Then it is processed, become flour. And then it's the Ministry of Industry, which is looking at it because now it's processed food. But then you finally place the product in the market, on the shelves in the shops. Then it's BPOM, which is responsible for controlling this product. For the two first ministries involved, the Ministry of Agriculture and the Ministry of Industry, they had used the international codex standards to set the limit for what was allowed to have in the ingredients for such products. But the last one, BPOM, they had wanted to protect the consumers a bit more, so they had changed it a bit. So the product was fine in the first and second phase, but in the third phase, when you put it on the market, then suddenly it was actually not in line, or it was not meeting the requirements by BPOM. This kind of lack of coordination can have some consequences, and this is what you shall ensure that it not happens. And therefore, good regulatory practice, it's not something Ministry of Agriculture or Ministry of Industry or BPOM can do alone. They have to do it together. They have to coordinate and ensure that there is some kind of coherency in the system. In that way, you avoid overlap, duplication, or conflict with legislation on other levels. Because it's also in country like, I mean, in Indonesia, there are also some of the legislation where the jurisdiction is on provincial level. Again, it's important that what is issued there is not in conflict with what you have on national level, or the other way around. So coherence, coordination, it's key aspects in good regulatory practice. The 11th is to develop the development of regulatory management capacity and performance at subnational levels. As I said, GRP is not only for the national level, it's also for the provincial level. So promote GRP on all legislative level, national, regional, provincial, whatever. The last recommendation from the OECD was to, in developing regulatory measures, give consideration to all relevant international standards and frameworks. OECD is also looking very much on trade, not the same way as World Trade Organization, but still. And one of the ways you internationally can avoid the situation where your legislation is not aligned with what is the legislation for similar products, for example, in other countries, it is that you give consideration to ensure that you are aligned with international standards. Standards, as I said last week, standards are not meant to be used as technical regulation. They are formulated in another way. They are they have requirements which are related to safety, but also other requirements. So so you can't just say that by implementing standards as technical regulation, then you are on the safe side and you are, but you should just ensure that what you issue of national technical regulation is not in conflict directly with what is said to be state of the art, or at least broadly agreed and written down in a standard. So utilize standards and other communities developing regulations or specifications in the same field, so that you are not isolating your market from other international markets. It's a long and perhaps also a bit boring introduction. I hope it'll be more interesting now, but in case you have any questions, you're welcome. I would like to have a 5 minutes break, if it's okay, unless we have some questions. Mita, do we have any questions?
There's 3 questions in chat room. You want to respond it now or after the break?
Let's have the break now, then they can think about if there are any questions. Otherwise, we just continue after the break. Okay?
Yeah.
5 minutes?
Yeah. There's 3 questions. Okay, you will respond after the break.
Can we take them after?
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Karsten. 5 minutes break, Bapak dan Ibu.
5 minutes break. Hi, Mita.
Yes, Karsten.
Just had a phone call, so therefore I had to. I have an old.
Okay. So now is the question from.
Yeah, let me hear.
Okay. The first one is from Bapak Swandaru from Ministry of Energy. Ada Bapak Swandaru? So here's the question.
Yeah.
Who is responsible for the synchronization of regulations or standards? Is it the ministry that initiates the standards or regulations, or the coordinating ministry or special institutions related to standards?
It's when you have new legislation, it will always be the ministry responsible for the new technical regulation, which is responsible for all coordination. It's when it comes to this specific piece of legislation. Standards, in my world, standards are voluntary. In the preparation of technical regulation, it's relevant to do a lot of research to find out where can we find inspiration, how it is done in other countries, and what kind of voluntary standards do we have in this specific field. So therefore, it's a responsibility of the ministry or agency developing or issuing the new technical regulation, also to ensure that it is aligned with standards. I think it's now we have a BSN as my beneficiary here. It's important to stress what their role is. Their role is only to develop standards. It's not to be deeply involved in technical regulation. They have some experience, some knowledge about standards and their status and so on, which can be helpful and can be a part of the information gathered by the ministry. But it's BSN will never have a direct say, or they shall not be involved deeply in the technical regulation. It's not their role. So I don't know if it answered the question. I hope so.
Okay. For the next question dari Bapak Norman. Ada Pak Norman?
My friend.
Yeah, Carsten, there's some question on the importance of the multi-stakeholder dialogue for the policies as good policy, as you mentioned. How they experience in Denmark, something like that.
We don't have a lot of meetings, focus group meetings and similar things in Denmark, even though we have all chances of having so, because it's a small country. If you invite to a multi-dialogue with people from Sulawesi and from North Sumatra, it's costly and it's perhaps not realistic. We have almost, from my time in the ministries, we got everything on writing. At that time, there were still sent letters, but today it's on email, I think. So we don't have many of these focus group meetings. I have tried it, as I said, when I did it in Bosnia, we had focus group meetings or dialogues about new legislation. It has its advantages to have these meetings. It's for sure more interesting, but it also has this, when you are sitting around a table and you know that from standardization, then there are people who speak loud and are convincing and they are good in the language. It was not a problem in Bosnia. They all spoke the same language, but there are people who are more dominant at meetings. So sometimes you are perhaps a bit too much influenced by the strong players around the table. So it's while the small, for example, when we met small and medium-sized enterprises, which were difficult to convince coming to these meetings, they were not saying much. It was the big professional ones who were dominating. So in a way, it has advantages, and it also has some disadvantages to have these meetings. But it was the ministry issuing the legislation which identified, had this list of people we could invite, and then we were because it was a project, reorganized, but they had the list of invitees. Yeah, it was not done by some kind of central governmental unit institution, not at all. It was done by the ministry itself. Okay. Do we have more, Mita, or shall we continue?
There's questions from Pak Ginting. Ada Pak Ginting? Okay.
I'm present. I'm here. Your
okay.
voice. Thank you.
Yeah.
Good afternoon, Mr.
Good afternoon.
Yeah. Nice to meet you again.
Nice to meet you too, even though I cannot see you. But
sorry, my camera.
No, it doesn't matter. It's fine.
Okay, that's me, man.
Yeah. Hi.
Yeah. Please, I have in QA. Better read by your staff my question. I have right there. My question is whether the result of the regulatory impact assessment can invalidate a technical regulation that is currently being implemented, and who is responsibility for conducting the regulatory impact assessment? This is my first question. Sorry.
Yeah, but let me take it before I forget if you have more. As I said, regulatory impact assessment shall be developed as early as possible. Of course, at that time, you may not have all the details in place with regard to sanctions, with regard to requirements, with regard to mandatory certification or whatever you will use in this legislation. So when you use it at an early stage and perhaps consider to have a mandatory certification, for example, then you can take this into consideration and say, what will it cost? So and then perhaps you find out that it is actually very costly and there'll be a lot of certification here. And what do we get out of it? I mean, are we more sure that things will, that the overall requirements will be, or the overall goals of this legislation will be achieved? So it can change something. It can change the way, because we work in regulatory impact assessment, we work with scenarios. So it may be, you may have in the ministry, your mindset set on one solution, but you find out that another solution actually is much cheaper and you get 90% of what you want to have. So perhaps it's a better solution. So yes, it can change something. Then you are asked, who will develop the regulatory impact assessment? Regulatory impact assessment, and this is what I like as a standardizer also, you follow kind of there is a guide, there is a way to do it. You can, of course, you will find lots of different guides and there are different approaches, but you have some kind of recipe what to do. Then you can do a full RIA, a full regulatory impact assessment. It can be perhaps 100 pages with a lot of details and economic calculations, and it requires a lot of resources, and you will typically not find such resources, at least not in the beginning, in the ministries. It means that you have to engage consultants. I mean, consultancies in Indonesia also, if you start doing this regularly, then they will build up some knowledge on this and then they will provide these services. Another thing, and which is I think quite useful, is to let the civil servants carry out so-called initial regulatory impact assessments. And we will come back to this on. they are much smaller. Let's say if a full RIA is 100 pages, then an initial RIA is perhaps 10 to 14 pages. And it includes much less, but it gives you a good indication of whether you should perhaps prepare a full RIA to find out what are the consequences of this, because there are a lot of open questions. But the initial RIA is you identify the stakeholders, you find out how big is this business actually. I mean, if you talk about a specific product area you want to regulate, how big is it? How much do we import? How much do we export? How much do we country? All these things, and then you find out who will be influenced by these new requirements you plan to implement. And then you can have interviews just by phone, get some inputs about their concerns if you do as you plan. You can also carry out some calculations, simple calculations of what are the costs. There are some direct costs and some indirect costs and some administrative costs. There are things which, and it's not rocket science. And as I said, it is documented only in 10 to 15 pages. So this is something which, in my opinion, is a good start and give people a good understanding of the benefits they can get out of it, instead of just sitting there with the legislation without thinking about the consequences. This opens eyes to what are the consequences of this. So, so there are two different kinds of RIAs, and there are also different groups you can ask to do it. Yeah.
Okay.
This is my reply, I think.
Okay. Thank you, Carsten, for your answer.
Good to see you.
Yeah. Maybe I continue, Carsten. There's one more question. It's very simple, I think. This is I have also find when I read or we are talking about the standard, something like that. My question is, why is it that every new regulation issued by the European Community always be, sorry, Carsten.
Okay.
Yeah. Why is that every new regulation issued by the European Community is always used as reference by ISO or IEC, especially those related to product, such as medical device, introductory medical device, drug, cosmetic, etc. That's true or not, Mr. Carsten?
You say what?
Thank you.
What I have to have this. Why they refer to ISO or IEC, or why they? I didn't get that part.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For example, maybe like new current now there is a MDR, medical device regulation, that is issued by the European Community.
Yeah.
When we read about the regulation, most of the regulation have been taken by the ISO standard or IC standard as a reference, something like that. Why?
It's easy to understand. And we have all these, when you talk about this regulation, which was earlier a directive, then we have the so-called harmonized standards, which are voluntary. But harmonized standards, they are standards for perhaps specific products under the medical device regulation, and they can be used to show compliance with the essential requirements in the legislation, in the regulation now. This is the way it works. When it comes to these very international, worldwide businesses like medical devices, electrical products, then it's these ISO standards are also adopted in Europe as CEN standards. So when we adopt them in Denmark, for example, then it will be an ISO/CEN EN because it's European /DS because it's a Danish standard. It's not. It's they have tried to move the standardization work from regional, it means European level, to international level, because these businesses are international. When we look at construction products, which is much more national and perhaps regional, then you will see that many of these standards we have in Europe supporting the construction product regulation or directive, they are regional, they are not international. There are certain areas, and you just pinpoint two of these areas: medical devices and electrical products, which are also sometimes a medical device. They are so international that the harmonized standards are actually also international standards. These harmonized standards are talked about, which are the ones which support or give presumption of compliance or conformity with the essential requirements. So therefore, it's not the European standards, it's international standards, but I can promise you, in IEC and in ISO, it's European companies you have around the table together with Americans and together with Japanese and together with Australians. But it's big, it's big business.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Thank you again.
You're welcome. Okay, shall we continue, Mita?
Yeah, actually there's one more from Bapak Swandaru. Do you want to respond it?
Yeah, we take the last one now, and then we continue.
Okay, so it's about the implementation of our regulation about risk-based business licensing provision. Is it included in the risk assessment? It's a bit technical, actually.
No, it's just repeat it one more time. I expected a longer.
Yeah, it's about the implementation of the risk-based business licensing. It's our regulation, Karsten. So Bapak Swandaru asked, is it included in the risk assessment?
Risk assessment, when it comes to good regulatory practice, and this is perhaps a problem with risk assessment, it is used in so many different contexts. Food risk assessment, risk assessment in the context of GRP. I think it's two different things we are talking about. When we talk about risk assessment and risk management and so on in GRP, then it's about knowing the consequences of what you are doing. I mean, that you also are prepared, that you have a plan B in case things do not necessarily go as you expect them to go. But the risk assessment itself, it has the same, that you try to identify the risks and you try to manage them. I mean, ensure that the risks do not come through, or these disadvantages you try to avoid. So it's I don't think it's the same we are talking about here, even though the process when it comes to risk management is very much the same. But I think it's two different things we're talking about. Okay, I think it's all I can say about this. I will continue.
Okay.
And now I'm glad that firstly I'll try. I'll stick to the time. I will not end later than I promised, which means 4 o'clock your time, 10 o'clock my time. And I will go a little bit quick through some of these slides here, because in the morning or in the afternoon for you, Papa Hugh, he actually presented WTO, which was, as he said, a result of the Uruguay round in the GATT system, and established the WTO in 1995. There was this Marrakesh Agreement, which is a short text, and it has these 4 annexes, where Annex 1 covers goods, services, and intellectual property rights. And then you have some horizontal annexes covering all these areas, namely dispute settlement, regular reviews, and special agreements, but this is not so important. Here you can see a graphic presentation of these different agreements, where we focus primarily on goods and not so much on services and intellectual property rights. The goods part is basically the old GATT agreement, about general agreement on tariffs and trade. And then you have dispute settlement, for example, if you have some disputes about, for example, new technical regulation, which has been notified. There are other countries which are complaining about the content or the consequences of this technical regulation. Then you can bring it in to this dispute settlement system where they discuss whether there is a problem or not, and they give advice or recommendations to the issuing country if something has to be changed. But it is a system where you don't have sanctions. You can't force, you can't use force and say, you shall do. You can only recommend and say, if you are part of this family here, then you have to follow the rules. But the consequences, it's not the same as we have in Europe, where we have a lot of common legislation and we also have a common EU court. This is not the case when it comes to WTO. When we look at the scope of the Tbt Agreement, which is the one we are interested in, then it covers trade in all kind of goods, also agricultural and industrial ones, and this is set out in Article 1.3. But there are areas which are not covered by the Tbt Agreement. Services, it's by GATS, purchasing specifications prepared by government, public tenders are not covered. Measures covered by sanitary and or SPS, by the SPS agreement. The SPS agreement is very similar to Tbt Agreement with regard to notification of new technical regulations which may have impact on the free trade. Then you shall carry out this notification to the Central Secretariat in Geneva, and they will share it with all the other members of WTO. And if they have any kind of concerns about the new legislation, then they can, in this public inquiry period, they can make their comments to this legislation, and then they it will be shared with the issuing country, with the notifying country, and then they may change the legislation if they agree. When we look at non-tariff barriers, then there are a lot of different ones. They are the ones which are other than those of financial nature. The financial nature, if you have some customs. You simply just say, if we shall import this car, then we put this custom on it because we don't want too many cars here, or we don't want people that the cars could be too cheap. So this is financial measures, but you can also do a lot of other things. Import licensing is one way to make it more difficult to export a specific good to a country. Rules for valuation of goods at customs. When you pay customs, because it is something you pay also to protect your domestic industry and so on, then it's quite often based on the value of the goods. But the higher the value of the good is, the more you should pay in taxes. And this system can somehow be made in a way so that all the goods you import, that they are given a higher value that they actually should have, and therefore the customs will also be higher. Pre-shipment inspection, something we know has been used a lot by the Russians. They sent delegations to, for example, to Denmark to make a check before you send something. It costs money for the company which wants to export to Russia. Rules of origin. If they say that in Europe, we had it also in our legislation here. When you wanted to buy something for a project, then it should be product which was produced in Europe. It was at least a rule back in time. Now it's not any longer. But the rules of origin were quite rigid, because it was not only, even though you had a trader in Europe who wanted to sell it to you, then if the product, for example, it could be a test device for a laboratory, if it was developed or produced in Japan, then we could not use it or buy it in a project. In that way, you protect your own companies, the domestic companies, and this is a way to hinder trade. And then you have technical barriers to trade, which are such ones here. It can be technical regulation. As we saw in Pavehu's presentation, this is where it tends to go. That instead of just saying that putting taxes or customs on tariffs on the goods, then we have technical regulations which make it more difficult to for example, to export to a specific country. There can be standards, especially if you have references to pure national standards, then it may be difficult for companies in other countries to make themselves familiar with the standards, or perhaps they can simply produce the standards or in accordance with the standards. We had some procurements in Denmark where we wanted to buy pavement for a huge square, and then there was an old Danish standards where the pavement was more thick and more, it could take the pressure of a truck crossing without breaking this pavement. But the problem was that you could never get this pavement from producers outside Denmark, because nobody used this standard any longer. The payment was typically thinner today, so they had to change the procurement also to ensure that other companies could make a bid. Testing and calibration requirements, inspection requirements, certification, packaging, labeling, and so on and so on. How do you use it? How do you create technical barriers to trade with these different kind of measures? For example, if you want to export to a specific country and it is required that your product is tested by a specific laboratory in this country, then, and this laboratory may even be a public owned one, where the prices may also differ for the domestic companies and for the foreign companies, then it's for sure a technical barrier to trade. This is a way to keep out competing goods from other countries. Standards, my example with the payment, the standards I referred to, the one with the thicker payment was in Danish also. So it made it even more difficult for a German or Swedish company to make a bid on this. Certification by a specific certification body. Again, it is like with the testing. If you somehow monopolize the providers of conformity assessment services, then you make it more difficult for companies outside the country to comply and be active on the market and give bids. How is the design of the Tbt Agreement? First of all, the overarching philosophy or principle is that you shall avoid unnecessary obstacles to international trade. It's on the one side, but at the same time, you shall allow regulatory autonomy to protect legitimate interests. And what are legitimate interests? It's, for example, national security. I don't know if you are aware that in Europe, Huawei, which is this Chinese company in the telecommunication business, they also make mobile phones. They also deliver equipment for the fifth generation mobile telecom technology. And there was great concerns about how the data, whether the data were used or misused by the Chinese. So therefore, there are in some of the countries simply made laws here in Europe that they will not allow Huawei to implement or to establish their systems in the countries, simply because they are afraid that they tap data. Then it can be about protection of human health or safety. If something very specific problem requires that you have to be extra strict here, then you may create a technical barrier to trade, but it is justified. Protection of animal and plant life, and one which is very much used and where we have a specific exemption in Europe, but it's also valid internationally in the WTO system, protection of environment. The protection of environment has reached very different levels in different countries. In Denmark, we are a bit almost hysterical about the environment. And it means that sometimes we introduce legislation which is quite restrictive and make it difficult for for companies outside Denmark to place their products on the Danish market. This was, for example, the case many years ago where we implemented a recycling system for plastic bottles used for non-carbonized water. It means just plain water. You have them a lot in Indonesia as well. The problem in Denmark was that we had never had it before because it was not something needed here. The temperature here is much lower, and it was because people were traveling around to countries where it was warmer, and they started getting used to buy this normal water. You can actually say it's like tap water. And the tap water you can drink it here in Denmark, but nevertheless, people, they bought these bottles, non-carbonized water. But the plastic bottles, they were not in the recycling system like it is, for example, for soft drinks or beers or something like that. So therefore, the bottles were just thrown in the ditches or wherever in the nature. And in order to protect the environment, we forced all the producers or companies placing this water on the market, forced them to be a part of the recycling system. It is costly. It is also a bit bureaucratic. But for companies like big providers of non-carbonized water like Evian in France, it was a way that the consequence was that they didn't want to be on the Danish market, but they complained about this legislation in the European system and said that it cannot be fair. In that way, it's only Danish companies are already involved in the recycling system for their soft drinks or beers and so on. And here we are thinking about Carlsberg, which is a Danish company. They said they're the only one who can be on the market. But when we brought it to court, we said it was for environmental reasons. It was not to keep out Evian from the market. It was simply because it became a problem that we had all these plastic bottles in the nature. So Denmark won the case simply because it was a legitimate objective to protect the environment. Key principles: non-discrimination, meaning that you cannot make legislation which discriminate, for example, companies from abroad. Avoidance of unnecessary barriers to trade. Use of international standards. Use of international standards is something we have been around already last week when we discussed good standardization practice, I think. But as I said, standards are not meant to be used for legislation. You will also find a lot of standards where the requirements, some of the requirements are in a way can be used in legislation, but others are a result of this process you have in a standardization committee, where the big players, they want to have some requirements which somehow exclude the cheaper and perhaps the Chinese producers. So if you just refer to a standard without knowing what the different, exactly the different requirements mean and what the consequences are of these, then you may exclude some companies, for example, in China, from complying with the requirements. So international standards shall be used, but be careful, make the references in the right way, and so on and so on. It's a specific topic. Technical assistance and special and differential treatment for developing countries. This is a basic principle in the WTO system that we shall try to help, for example, the African developing countries in order to comply with the principles in the EU, in the WTO system. And it can be done in many different ways. I'll not go into it here. When you look at good regulatory practice and WTO agreement, then the Tbt Agreement aims to ensure that technical regulations, standards, and conformity assessment procedures are non-discriminatory and do not create unnecessary obstacles to trade. This is done the way that you have this notification of new technical regulations so that other members of WTO can complain or comment. And you also have, in general, a transparency in the development of new technical regulation. For good regulatory practices are processes and tools to help to improve the quality and effectiveness of, in this case, it's written SPS, but also Tbt measures so that they can protect humans and also animals, plant life and health without creating unnecessary barriers to trade. So there is some kind of common area of common ground for these two agreements, or for good regulatory practice and for the WTO Tbt Agreement. When you look at the Tbt Agreement, then unnecessary regulatory differences can impose costs that prevent businesses from engaging in trade. This is not what we want. We want as much trade as possible. The more the more products we have on the shelves, the lower prices and the higher quality. Simply because it's in a way the survival of the fittest, meaning that if products are not safe, if they're too expensive, then they will simply be squeezed out of the market by more competitive products. I'll not say much more about this. So the WTO Tbt Agreement, Article 2.2, members shall ensure that technical regulations are not prepared, adopted, or applied with a view to, or with the effect to create unnecessary obstacles to international trade. Technical regulations shall not be maintained if circumstances or objectives giving rise to their adoption no longer exist. Very similar to what you see in good regulatory practice. Sometimes you shall do a so-called ex post review. It means that you look at your stock of legislation and say, this one is not relevant anymore. We can repeal it. Where technical regulations are required and relevant, international standards exist, or their completion is imminent, members shall use them or the relevant parts of them as a basis for the technical regulation. It means that you shall not invent, you shall not sit and invent requirements in the work on technical regulation. You shall simply just find inspiration, ensure that what you write into the technical regulation is not totally in conflict with what has been agreed in the standard. Here I planned a break. I will not have it. We just had it a little earlier. But now I'll go to the last slides, which will be about the core elements of DRP, because as I said earlier, there are a lot of recommendations with regard to good regulatory practice. Some of it is top governmental level decisions. It's about making the policy. We want good regulatory practice here in this country. It's about establishing a coordination body or a coordination unit which can train people in how to carry out regulatory impact assessment, who can make assessment or reviews of the legislation, which can ensure that the rules made are implemented or adopted in the same way in all ministries and so on. This is something which is not close to the normal civil servant. This is something you decide once and then it shall be implemented. What you meet all the time is the need for internal coordination of rulemaking activities. I gave you this. It involves all the ministries and agencies and other kind of bodies in the public sphere, and it's something you should actually think of when you are sitting developing new technical regulation. Public consultation mechanisms to improve transparency is another part you will meet if good regulatory practice is implemented. If you go to the EU website, you will find a place, actually more than one place, I think, where you can see what new legislation is in pipeline, and you can make comments. And these comments are actually public, so you can see what other they have made of comments to a specific piece of legislation. If something similar was implemented in Indonesia, then this is where you get your information about what the public think about what you are working on. We can also, as we discussed here in the little break, implement specific procedures for some kind of roundtable discussions or focus group discussions or meetings. There are many ways of doing this. In Denmark, where I know the system the best, of course, we circulated new technical regulation to the business associations, which would be directly impacted by the new legislation. When I worked later on at Danish Standards sometimes got an invitation to look at some piece of legislation and give their comments, because Danish Standards had some kind of horizontal view on many things, and even though it was not, they didn't ask for political the political meaning or opinion about something. It was more seen from a technical point of view. So an efficient way to get inputs in this public consultation is to send it out directly to those organizations which represent the main stakeholders. So if you change something, for example, with regard to food safety, then perhaps this GAPMMI, Capmini, or whatever it is, organization, they may be interested, and they will scrutinize this legislation. Perhaps they have their own internal meetings to discuss what are their position with regard to this legislation, and then they can send it. And finally, the regulatory impact assessment, particularly the capacity to ensure that the better policy options are chosen by establishing systematic and consistent framework for assessing the potential impacts of government actions. the best possible solution. It is the best of these scenarios you set up when you develop your regulatory impact assessment. When we start looking at the first part, the internal coordination of rule-making activities, then one of the recommendations was that a standing body charged with regulatory oversight should be established close to the center of the government. I'm not an expert in Indonesian governmental structure, but it sounds very much like Bapanas or something like that, a unit under Bapanas, which is coordinating and has an overview of what is going on in the different ministries. Such a place, it would be natural to establish a body which could keep the oversight of what was going on. But the specific institutional solution must be adapted to each system of governments. The authority of this regulatory oversight body should be set forth in a mandate, such as a statute or executive order or a ministerial or perhaps a presidential decree. In its this body's performance of its technical functions, the oversight body should be independent from political influence. It's very important when you have somebody who assess that they don't have some kind of position, saying, for example, if you place such a body closer to some specific legislation, which is should also be developed with respect of good regulatory practice, then it can be somehow biased. So it has to have a position where it is a bit independent of the political influence. So this body, it should be tasked with jobs or tasks such as quality control through the review of the quality of impact assessments. When we come to regulatory impact assessment, you will see that it can be done in different ways, and it can also be done with different depth, and therefore also with different quality. If you have a central body which assess the quality of these regulatory impact assessments, then you will ensure that the depth, the quality of these are more or less on the same level, no matter if it's developed by one or another ministry. They shall examine the potential for regulation to be more effective, systematic improvement of the application of regulatory policy, and ex-post evaluation of policy revision. This is perhaps the most important one, that you don't look only on the new legislation. You have only one body which actually look at the existing legislation and assess whether there is a need for revision or repealing some legislation. And then they could provide training and guidance on impact assessment and strategies for improving regulatory performance. And these the performance of the oversight body includes its review of impact assessments and should be periodically assessed. The final slide about oh, sorry, I think I have some problems with my computer, sorry. Public consultation mechanisms, how to improve transparency. Governments, they should establish a clear policy identifying how open and balanced a public consultation should be on the development of new rules shall take place. They should cooperate with stakeholders on reviewing existing and developing new regulations, and it should be done by engaging relevant stakeholders during the regulation process and designing consultation process to maximize the quality of the information received and its effectiveness. What does it mean? It means that it is not wrong as a civil servant to be in contact with the users, the stakeholders who have a deep interest in some new legislation. Of course, if one of these parties, one of these stakeholders start to dictate how things should be done, then you have a problem. But the involvement of stakeholders in the legislative process is actually a big plus. And they shall be consulting all aspects of impact assessment analysis and using, for example, impact assessment as part of the consultation process. When I worked in Sarajevo, in Bosnia, when we published new technical regulation, it was always together with the regulatory impact assessment, so that people who could not read a piece of legislation and say, here's a problem, they could actually see or read the regulatory impact assessment and say, okay, they think that the losers, if you can say so, the losers when we implement this legislation will be the small and medium-sized enterprises, or it will be the big companies. The public consultation part is also to make available to the public, as far as possible at least, all relevant material from regulatory dossiers, including the supporting analysis and so on. This is what we did. You could include even more than we did in Bosnia, but we had the legislation and the regulatory impact assessment, which was quite comprehensive. We did not use initial regulatory impact assessments. It was full regulatory impact assessments, but it was also primary legislation which had a huge impact on the trade and the requirements to the producers of different kinds of products. You should structure reviews of regulations around the needs of those affected by the regulations. It's important to say, what are the consequences for this group, for these this kind of companies, for these consultancies, for these who are all active in the business? It's important that you somehow make it clear that these are the consequences of the legislation for these specific groups. You shall introduce the regular performance assessments, and you shall communicate the results of the assessments to the public. Furthermore, you shall make sure that policies and practices for inspections and enforcement respect the legitimate rights of those subject to the enforcement. For example, when we introduced market surveillance in Eastern Europe, it also meant that the inspectors, they went into different shops and took some samples, products, and sometimes these products, they had some shortcomings. They were not compliant with the legislation. But the problem was that you can't just take things from the shelves without without paying for them, and it created a lot of problems that the shop owners, they didn't want to give it for free to the inspectors, and therefore they had to change the legislation so that the inspectors actually bought these products, and then sometimes they borrowed them if it was too expensive, but they basically bought the products and to take them out of the shop and to check them in case the products were non-compliant, seriously non-compliant, then they didn't pay for the product, because then it should be taken out of the shop anyway. But this was a part of the enforcement, but it was also a way to protect the shop owners that this change in the legislation was made. And then all legislation, all regulations should be easily accessible by the public. In Denmark, we have, for each ministry, we have a list of the legislation they are responsible for. We also have something similar to what we have on European level. In European, we have Eurolex, which is a huge database with EU legislation, quite easy to search in. And in Denmark, we have something similar. This is what is recommended. It's not what you find in all countries, but this is what is recommended. So this is actually what we had, a regulatory database, which is freely available. This is the difference between standards and legislation. Standards, if you want to look into a standard, you have to buy it. It's not for free, while legislation shall be free of charge. Government should also have a policy that requires regulatory text to be drafted in plain language. This is a part of this to ensure that everybody can understand and actually live up to the requirements or in the legislation. They should also provide clear guidance on compliance with regulation. Sometimes it can be complicated. I realized it earlier in our project here in Indonesia. There is specific legislation in Europe for food contact materials. Food contact materials is, as you can hear, all materials or all wrapping material and so on, which is in contact with food. Typically it is plastic, but it can also be other kind of things. When you have some plastic, then you shall, based on the European legislation, test whether this plastic migrates some substances into the meat, for example, if it is used for meat. But there may also be on the top of the plastic a little sticker where there is some print on the sticker. Then you can not only say we test the plastic, we should also test this sticker, the glue, the ink used on the sticker, or the label. All these things make it much more difficult actually to show compliance with the legislation. So I realized during this training, where I just was looking at a trainer carrying out the training, I realized that this is not legislation which is easy to comply with, because you have to have a really very academic or scientific education to understand how to combine the different requirement or the different test methods for the different kind of wrapping material. Because suddenly you have not only one, that's the plastic, but you have plastic, glue, paper. It's not so, and then some ink, and it can all go through into the material. If the plastic is of a certain kind, it can go through the material and into the meat or whatever you have, food product you have in it. So some legislation is not made in a plain language and easy understandable, but this is how it is. Objectives should be included in preambles. If you look into the European legislation, you will always see that there is a long preamble telling that giving this that under this circumstance to take care of this, and then that you have number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, it can be really long, where it actually, the full justification for the legislation is written there. And then you have the articles afterwards, which can be clearly related to the preamble, to these, the reason why the justification for the whole legislation. And then stakeholders, they should be given sufficient time and information to be able to make their comments on the proposed measures. This is similar to what you know from the WTO system, perhaps, when you have make a notification of some new technical regulation, say, we would like to issue this piece of legislation. Please have a look at it. If you have any comments, come back to us with it within 60 days. This is the normal time you have to make comments, 2 months to make comments on new technical regulation. This is what is used in the WTO system and typically also used domestically, but it may vary from country to country. I think this is the last slide about public consultation. You should have this appropriate time, similar to the one in the WTO notification process. When you implement new legislation which dramatically change the work environment for companies or for other users of the legislation, then you should have a transitional period, a period where you can perhaps both use the old legislation and the new legislation. Very much used in the construction product area in Europe, where all the different countries in Europe, they had their own legislation for construction products. And when they changed to harmonize this area, they had to give a very long transitional period where people, they got used to the new rules, to the European rules. So there was a transitional period of, I think, 2 years for many areas, simply just to give the companies a chance to adapt to the new system. So a minimum of 6 months should be allowed as a transitional period by which the stakeholders can prepare for compliance with the regulation. This is what WTO they recommend. The consequences of non-compliance should be very clear and be enforceable. Again, one of the examples from the implementation of market surveillance in the Eastern European countries, many of these countries, they did not have experience with this, and the fines were not proportionate to the shortcomings in, for example, labeling. If you found a product as an inspector in a shop and the label was not translated into local language, then they made a fine, and they automatically gave a fine perhaps of 1,500 euro. A very big fine for such a simple thing. But there were no, they just used the old system they had because they had the right to issue fines. And in this system, the fines were on this level because it was more serious shortcomings or almost criminal things they regulated at that time. So therefore, it's important that you have some kind of system for example, fines. When do you get a warning? When do you get a fine? When do you have to take the product back from the market? And what are the consequences? So this kind of transparency in the system is quite important. The last thing we are going to talk about today before I end my presentation is that it's a regulatory impact assessment, where we go much more into details tomorrow and look at it more as a kind of a tool or a procedure you go through. Regulatory impact assessment can be adopted as ex ante. It means before you issue the legislation, and it shall be proportional to the significance of the regulation. You don't have to make regulatory impact assessment every time you make a little adjustment in some existing legislation, or you just have a minor regulation. It can be perhaps done only for the primary legislation where you really change a system and where the consequences are perhaps little less clear because it's a big and radical change. It shall include cost-benefit analysis that consider the welfare impacts of the regulation, taking into account the economic and social and environmental impacts, the distributional effects over time, who are the winners and who are the losers. It's a very important thing. Again, the European regulations where suddenly a lot of products were regulated very tight. It had some consequences for the small and medium-sized companies, and therefore they were the losers. And since there were a lot of small companies, family-owned companies, then you should be aware of that before you actually started implementing the legislation, and at least give a long transition period so that they could adapt to the new regulation. When you carry out a regulatory impact assessment, it should include considerations of alternative ways of addressing the public policy objectives, the scenarios, as I said, with this example about the scrapped cars. It's not always the best way. It's not always best if the public authorities are giving a lot of responsibilities with regard to control and so on. It can be very resource demanding. So in that case, we decided this certification solution instead. It shall include regulatory and non-regulatory alternatives. In certain situations, you may just train or inform about something. It's also a way to regulate a market if people are informed, but it depends on where people they get information. If you want to change behavior in the whole country, let's say we have too many people with cancer because of smoking habits, then you can inform about the consequences. You can also put some warnings on what we have done in Europe, warnings on the cigarette saying that you get cancer or you get pale skin or whatever. I mean, there are all kinds of consequences of smoking, and you don't have necessarily to regulate it, but you can just inform about the consequences of smoking. This is a way perhaps you can reduce the smoking in a country. The no action option should always be considered, that you don't do anything. Sometimes political objectives are based on some specific situation that you have. For example, we had unfortunately a young woman who was killed in a nightlife in one of the cities here in Denmark just a few weeks ago, and then they immediately start discussing whether there should be more cameras like they have in London in the streets. But it has a lot of other consequences when you start having such a society where you have cameras all over the place. So there can also be an overreaction if something happens, like the case I told you about, and then perhaps after period, you step back and say, okay, perhaps we should not change anything here. Ex-ante assessment should, in most cases, identify approaches likely to deliver the greatest net benefits. You will see tomorrow when I present how to calculate the costs and benefits and so on, that sometimes it's quite obvious what is the best solution. Of course, if you have some specific examples to work on. When regulatory proposals would have significant impact, ex-ante assessment of cost and benefits and risk should be quantitative whenever it's possible. It is sometimes possible to calculate, for example, how much will it cost for 1,000 companies to get this certification which is needed. This is easy to calculate, but it can be more difficult if you, for example, try to regulate the smoke habits in a country, because the consequence on the long term is perhaps that there will be fewer people hospitalized with cancer in the lungs and so on. But in the short run, you cannot really see any kind of effect. So therefore, you cannot always quantify it with money. I mean, this is how much we save in the health system if people stop smoking. So therefore, it's only whenever it is possible that you should put figures on things. Regulatory costs include direct costs, which are administrative, financial, and capital costs, as well as indirect costs. We'll come back to that tomorrow. Ex-ante assessment should, where relevant, provide qualitative descriptions of those impacts that are difficult or impossible to quantify. It's all these life quality issues. If you look at these bottles I talked about, which were thrown in the nature in Denmark, it doesn't change people's life a lot, but it's just more nice if you walk in the nature that it's clean. It doesn't. Nobody wants to see bottles thrown all over in the forest or wherever you walk. So you can only describe it narrative that these are the benefits, one of the benefits. Then of course the more, the environmental benefits. Plastic takes time before it's gone, perhaps 100 years or something like that before it's totally gone from the nature. So you should describe this as well. Regulatory impact assessment should, as far as possible, be made public available along with the regulatory proposals, as we did in Bosnia, where we had the proposal and the regulatory impact assessment side by side when we had public consultation. The analysis should be prepared in a suitable form and with adequate time to gain input from stakeholders and assist political decision making. It takes time to deliver or to prepare regulatory impact assessment. It requires resources for interviews, a lot of calculations. You shall get information or data from statistical office and so on and so on. So you shall allocate sufficient time. Good practice would involve using regulatory impact assessment or analysis as a part of the consultation process, yes. And ex-ante policy should indicate that the regulation should seek to enhance, not deter, competition and consumer welfare. And this is something, for example, when you introduce new legislation which in a way squeeze out small and medium-sized companies, then you don't facilitate trade. Actually, you may end up with fewer companies in a market. So when carrying out an assessment, officials should assess economic, social, and environmental impacts. I think we have been here. And RIA should be supported with clear policies, training programs, guidance, and quality control mechanisms for data collection and use. We come back to that tomorrow. What kind of data are needed to prepare a good regulatory impact assessment? RIA should be integrated early in the process, and there should be an evaluation of the competitive effects of the regulation on the various economic players. Last two slides, which is actually one long checklist for development of technical regulations. They shall serve clearly identified policy objectives. They shall be effective, and in achieving the objectives, means of measuring should be included. They have a sound legal and risk assessment basis, shall know the consequences of what you're doing. Also, produce benefits and justify costs. We have this expression in some countries that you should not shoot birds with cannons. Sometimes you can solve problems in a simple way and not necessarily with a complicated technical regulation. Take economic, environmental, and social effects into account. A lot of legislation cannot, the benefits of a lot of legislation cannot be monetized. You cannot put money on it. You cannot say that you get so much out of it. But there may be a lot of other effects, like more healthy environment, more life quality for some people, and so on and so on. It shall also be taken into account. Minimize cost and market distortions. Be clear, simple, and practical for the users. For example, written in plain language. Be consistent with other regulations and policies. It's a coordination, also with legislation issued by other ministries. Be transparent to both regulators and those affected by the regulation, and be based on international or national standards that are harmonized to international standards. This is a trade-related issue that you should try to not to go solo. You should try to find solutions which are compatible or harmonized with international solutions. Reference only those part of the standards that represent minimum requirements. Something is missing there. As I said, many standards, they have requirements which are absolutely relevant for safety, for health, for environment, but there may also be other requirements which are a result of this negotiation you have in a standardization committee. So in many areas, I had my friend who was aware about the medical devices regulation, or this medical devices area. It's the big players who are sitting there discussing solutions which has huge influences for their companies. So therefore, if they can somehow convince the other members of a committee that their solution is better, then they may save billions or millions at least in developing costs or other costs. So therefore, it's a big game sometimes. Standardization. Be least restrictive to achieve the desired objectives. Control is fine, but sometimes trust and believe that people are compliant with the regulation is sufficient. As I said, the whole change in Europe when we established the single market was that we took the responsibilities from the authorities and gave it to the manufacturers. But still the authorities checked the products when they were placed on the market, but it was a huge change of the whole philosophy in many countries. And accord equal treatment to products of national origin and like products from elsewhere. that we try not to, we don't use or regulate in a way so that we give some kind of preferences to domestic products. I have been working in many countries. I spent a couple of years in Palestine, the neighboring country to Israel. And in Palestine, when I had meetings with the private sector, then they saw standardization and regulation basically as tools to protect the domestic production. It is a special country, Palestine, but still it was difficult for me because I came with a totally opposite message, namely that they should open up and get competition, ensure lower prices and better quality. So sometimes it can be difficult to be achieved. It was today's presentation, bit long, in my opinion, also a bit too theoretical, but this is what we have to go through. If you want to understand good regulatory practice, you have to understand that this is very much based on recommendations and principles. And of course, when you try to transfer these recommendations into the systems, then it becomes much more practical. Transparency, it is distribution or dissemination of new legislation to interested parties so that they can make comments, or it is focus group meetings and so on. But there is a lot of thinking behind it. This is what I've tried to present the last couple of hours. It was a lot of talk. I hope tomorrow it'll be a bit more interesting when we talk about regulatory impact assessment, because it is more hands-on. It's actually, I have tried to present a tool you can use if you don't develop regulatory impact assessment, then at least the thinking behind can be used when you are sitting in a situation where you shall regulate an area in one way or another. So this is all from me from now. I don't know if there are any questions. Mita, I can see that you have turned on your camera.
There is no sound.
Amita, you have turned off your...
Hello?
Hi.
Hello, yeah, that's good.
Okay. There's 5 questions in chat room. Do you want to respond it today?
Yeah, we have 2 minutes. We see.
Okay. So, okay, the first one from Ibu Desi, it's from YouTube. So it's about public consultation. How long is the ideal time for public consultation and how to respond input from public?
Typically 60 days. This is what we aim at. This is what we aim at in standardization. This is what they aim at in the WTO system. And this is typically also what you use in the domestic consultation period. Sometimes it's shortened a bit if it's something urgent, but typically 60 days. The way you do, when you get all these comments, then you actually prepare, compile, like you also know from standardization, where you have technical and editorial comments. Here you have only technical comments because it's always people who have some concerns who write. Sometimes there are also people who are very positive, of course. Then you compile everything in a document, which is where you present all the different positions. And in this document, you can also see we have from this association received comments where they share their concerns about the fines, or they share their concerns about the transition period, which is too short, or they share their concerns about the consequences for small and medium-sized enterprises. So you take all the comments and write one document, which is also published, which is also public available after it has been done. This is what we do in Denmark. I can only say I don't know exactly how they do worldwide, but this is the way we did it. Okay.
Okay. The next is from Ibu Widayati. It's from YouTube. It's about mandatory SNI. It's for furniture for elementary and secondary high school. So can you make comments?
Yeah.
Can you make comments about this SNI?
Yeah.
Because there's in her technical committee, they never talk about mandatory SNI. Is there any sanction if a company breaking these regulatory practices?
I think I understand the question. It's an area which is not so regulated, funny enough, because it has a lot of consequences. If you have furniture which is not good ergonomically for children, it is important that they sit well while they're at school. So I can understand to a certain degree, at least, why it has been made mandatory, because it is important that our young people, that they have a good start of life when it comes to comfort and so on when they sit. With regard to, but I can tell you that we don't have that kind of regulation in Denmark. We have competition, so that the producers, they try to present when they sell these products why their products is better than other products. So it's in a way self-regulated through the market. But let's go back to the question. If such a product is mandatory, then you get what you want. I mean, you get quality, a certain level of quality, and ergonomic correctness, and all these things. It depends on how it has been used. How it has been done mandatory. If you have another regulation and they say when it comes to school furniture, then you shall use because it's mandatory. This technical regulation, then in the main legislation there should be some kind of sanctions in case it's non-compliant. But you can also have the situation that the supplier is try to sell something. He says it's compliant, but it's not compliant. It's another situation. It's then you have to look at the general rules about, I mean, if you don't deliver what you say you deliver, then you just have a basic problem if it's brought to court. So it's a little unclear what kind of, but it is important always to have some kind of sanctions. But sometimes the sanctions are the general ones for, if you have fraud or things like that. So I don't know if it's a reply really, but yeah, it's all I can say actually on this, Anita.
Okay, thank you, Carsten. The next question from Bapak Winhard Tampu Bolon from Geospatial Information Agency of Indonesia. Regarding environment protection, wouldn't it be better by initiate a technical regulation? For example, if you give an example of bottle can in Germany, there is an inclusive fund for its plastic bottle.
Yeah, this is also what we have in Denmark.
Okay.
There are lots of ways of doing things. I have sometimes promised myself that I will never say anything about palm oil, but now I say it anyway, because I know it's a very sensitive. I'm sitting here as a European. I'm not a politician or anything, but actually the dispute about palm oil, it's very much about how they look at environmental issues in Europe, it's also very much about lobbyism in Europe, no doubt. But it is, they do a lot, because they do a lot of things which are justified by environmental arguments. And it is a gray zone whether sometimes these arguments are strong enough to be allowed in the WTO system. I have not followed the palm oil case closely, but I have a lot of sympathy with Indonesia, because I believe it's more a lobbyism thing than it has something to do with anything else. So, but yeah, there are many ways of solving things, but when it comes to environment, but it depends on the situation. They have done it this way in Germany. Full respect. We have the same in Denmark. We cannot buy. You can when you go to a shop now, you don't get a plastic bag. You pay for free any longer, for a very small amount. Now you pay quite a lot, and it means that people, they use other kind of bags now instead of plastic bags. It costs €0.50 more or less for a plastic bag, something like €0.50, and it's quite a lot, but just something you throw out. Yeah.
Okay. The next is from Bapak Edi Wiloso.
He's here.
Yeah. WTO allows Tbt if a country has proper justification or legitimate objectives like national security, environment protection. Is this statement correct? Are palm oil restriction in EU market, like certification and regulation, and halal certification in Indonesia within this category? Are these two cases or practices acceptable from the point of view WTO?
Yeah, this halal, it's certainly fully acceptable if there are some restrictions because of this. There were a lot of different examples in this question, I think. I mean, I don't know exactly where palm oil case is right now, but I guess it has been brought into the WTO dispute panel and been discussed there. But it's obviously some Europeans who think that they shall try to protect the forests in Malaysia and also in Indonesia and so on, and they believe that this is the right way to do it. Yeah, what can I say?
Yeah, Carsten, if I may, I want to understand the point of view of WTO, because if you restrict or incoming goods to Europe the same way incoming goods to Indonesia, in Indonesian case is halal, and in European is palm oil. I think it is the same situation, like barrier to trade, according to your definition.
My definition.
Am I correct? Because WTO says that Tbt is allowed, right? If a country has proper justification or legitimate objective. So European define their objective, protecting environment, for example, and Indonesia, because dominating by Muslim religion. I just want to understand from that point of view. Both, according to my understanding, then they are both technical barrier. Am I correct?
Yeah, I mean, it's. I mean, let's take halal first. I mean, halal is it's not a technical barrier to have requirements to a product, and the requirements are totally justified through religious demands or rules. So in my opinion, there is no problem, and it will never be. We will never insist from European side that you shall accept products which are not halal. It will never. I mean, from any side. It's also Europe is also multicultural. We also have a lot of Muslims in Denmark and so on. So we fully we have no problems in that. I think even though I promised myself not to talk about palm oil, I think the case is a bit different. I mean, it came. My understanding is that there were some lobbyists who represent olive oil production and all other kind of oils which can be replaced palm oil in food production. They influenced some politicians in the European Parliament and said that it is not sustainable the way they produce palm oil. And therefore, and it is in general, because Europe is quite big, they have a lot of rules where you can say they are European rules, but actually you should comply with them if you want to export to Europe. I know a bit more about fish. All these rules about illegal and it's illegal, unreported and unregulated fishery. It's a European legislation, but you cannot export your fish unless you have small tracker, GPS on your boat, on your vessels, and you live up to this and this and this. Because they try from European side to protect the fish in all over the world. So they don't want to eat fish if it's not fished in a court in a way so that we protect the fish. So therefore, and it's the same with this palm oil, that they have some, I don't know, political objectives, and they can simply they can apply them on you, because they say if you don't do this, we don't want to buy. Yes. Same with this, and you'll find it in many areas. I don't think it goes the other way. You can say that this halal, no, it's something which we managed already for many other markets, so it's not so special.
So fish from Indonesia, which is produced not in proper way and restricted being entered to Europe, is a technical barrier. Am I correct?
It's not a technical barrier. It's just because, I mean, they want to protect not only European, and this,
I understand.
But I don't like to call it a technical barrier because I mean, all European legislation is notified in a WTO system. All European, I mean, it's not done by Denmark. When we implement new technical European legislation, it's done by the Commission. The Commission, they notify that now we implement a revised version of Medical Devices Directive or something about illegal and unregulated fishery. When they do that, when they notify that, then all countries or members of WTO all over the world, they can make their comments. You can also make comments. And then,
thank you, Carsten.
Then if there is a dispute, then they take it there. It's not technical barrier. It has at least been, it has gone through this assessment which has been carried out.
Okay.
Okay, sorry for the long reply. It's time to end, Mita.
Yeah, actually there's the last question.
Last question, okay.
Okay, from Mr. Norman, how to make RIA will be more effective to ensure the more expected regulation in front stakeholders of development. Does the political atmosphere bring impact to RIA process?
I think it's a RIA question. I think we can take it tomorrow. If you remember it, because tomorrow you talk much more about it.
Yeah.
And then we save 2 minutes also. Okay?
Agree, Carsten.
Agree.
Yeah, agree.
Thank you very much.
Very clear.
Thank you very much for your patience.
Ya, makasih Bu Mita.
Okay, Carsten.
Okay,
because
Mita.
if we discuss today, we don't have to discuss tomorrow, yeah, because
Exactly.
we must discuss that tomorrow. Okay, thank you.
Super.
Exactly.
Mita, you can close the meeting. Thank you from my side.
Okay.
And then you can say a few words in Bahasa, and then hopefully see you tomorrow again.
Oke, thank you, Karsten.
Welcome.
Baik, Bapak dan Ibu, peserta workshop Good Regulatory Practice hari ini, terima kasih sudah bergabung hingga sore ini. Besok akan dilanjutkan lagi sesi kedua, mulai pukul 13 sampai pukul 16, lebih detail mengenai RIA. Terima kasih atas partisipasinya. Jangan lupa mengisi daftar hadir ya, Bapak Ibu, baik yang di YouTube maupun di Zoom. Terima kasih.
Oke, terima kasih. Sama-sama, sama-sama. Izin.
Thank you, Carsten.
Terima kasih Mbak
See you
Siti,
later,
Mbak Maya.
Terima kasih Mbak Mita. Thank you Karsten. Thank you semua
Thank
Bapak
you
Ibu.
everybody. Thank you everybody.
Thank you, everybody. See you tomorrow.
Terima kasih Pak.